And welcome everybody to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, February 2nd. February 2nd is many things. Groundhog Day for some people. It's the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad for some others. But what it certainly is for us is 36 hours before 37 hours, to be exact, before our conference, The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. We picked that theme because in one sense we are engaged as humanity in a kind of great civil war on the question of our true nature. This isn't a new topic. It's something that has been being discussed in philosophical schools and so on for many years. Back in 1978, when Lyndon LaRouche wrote a work called The Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elites, he argued that the entirety of the history of what's called Western civilization, at least, is defined by the conflict still unresolved between the philosopher and student of Socrates, Plato, and his ostensible student who was actually his opponent, Aristotle. And that all of history can essentially be divided from the standpoint of successive regimes and forms of government in and dominated by Western civilization by the battle between the Platonic outlook and the Aristotelian outlooks. We won't presume to do more than to identify that right now. But what is characteristic of the Platonic outlook is the notion that there is a divine spark that is characteristic of humanity and which is expressed in the creativity of the human species and the ability of the human species to transform its very species nature. That is, its species nature is to transform its species nature. It does not evolve physiologically per se. The human race does not evolve by means of there's neurophysiological changes, but it's cognitive. We do, using ideas, what other species have to do using their physiology as such. And as a result of this, time is very different for us. We're able to do things in relatively instantaneously that other species may take centuries, millennia, or eons even to do. That makes each individual sacred and essential to the whole of the human race. And you cannot have too many people from the Platonic outlook and from this Platonic standpoint. Some people consider that to be so idealistic, but it's not. It's actually, let's put it this way, it is the nature of the human being. Now, that is not the dominant outlook, at least that has been foisted upon the world in the form of geopolitics, which has a different view. It thinks of human beings as being clever beasts with different kinds of traits and perhaps talents, but there are some that are superior to others. And the idea is that reality, that brutal reality, is what is codified in the political processes and systems of the planet, and you just have to get used to it. So you have to have a predatory form of economics, a predatory form of culture, a predatory form of a rule, sometimes called the rule of law. And it must be predatory because the nature of human beings is that there simply are some that are better than others. And the elimination of the bad in the form of the good, in favor of the good, is the ostensible drive of, so if you will, Darwinist notions, or social Darwinist notions, at least, of evolution. There's more that could be said about that, more need not be said. Where we are tonight is in a very particular location on the planet. I don't mean where we are geographically, I mean where we are historically. Pope Francis in Kinshasa, Congo, which is the most Catholic of countries in Africa, was greeted with 1 million persons or spoke a sort of open air process of seeing 1 million people. And he had very sharp words to say about the colonial past. He's 86 years old, let's remember, so he's seen a lot. He said, the poison of greed has smeared the diamonds of Congo with blood. It is a tragedy that these lands and more generally the whole African continent continue to endure various forms of exploitation. Stop choking Africa. It is not it is not a mine to be stripped or a terrain to be plundered. So this is sort of very, I won't say it's unpontiff-like, but it certainly was a full-throated denunciation of the processes of looting of those countries going on now in the name of the Great Reset, now in the name of green energy, now in the name of electric vehicles, etc. But what is important here is that same sentiment was being echoed across the Atlantic in Brazil, the most Catholic country that there is. 127 million people there are Catholic. And it should be also noted that Brazil is the second largest concentration of people of African descent in the world. It's only slightly behind Nigeria, significantly behind Nigeria, it's the largest concentration of Africans outside of Africa for sure, way larger, of course, than the United States. And there, Lula da Silva, the newly elected president, made it clear to Chancellor Scholz of Germany that he would not participate in the filthy Ukraine war. He would not get involved. He said maybe what we need is a club for peace. And the actions that the Pope has taken in terms of trying to get something together with Ukraine, in terms of the idea of Russia, NATO, Ukraine, and others negotiating with no preconditions, something that got advanced by the Vatican toward the end of last year, which was picked up on by us, that sort of initiative becomes very important. When you say Brazil, you're also really saying Argentina, because Argentina and Brazil have been collaborating sort of like, not in as strong a fashion yet, but sort of like Russia and China have begun a certain kind of collaboration. In fact, this Saturday will be the first anniversary, mark the one-year date of the memorandum of understanding that the Chinese government and Russian government made public, in which they stated that they were irreparably connected as a single frame of reference to the eradication of colonialism, the eradication of poverty, and the eradication, so far as they could be involved in ensuring it, of various forms of imperial warfare. While many denounce Russia for what it did in the special military operation, and while certainly one can criticize the way in which the process led up to it and what might have been done differently, the fact of the matter is that the last thing that war is a predatory imperialist incursion into Ukraine. It's nothing to do with it. We're not going to get into that because the speaker we have tonight can say various things both about that and other things. I don't have to do more than allude to it. I would like to say about this Battle of Stalingrad, though, I just want people to understand, today is the 80th anniversary, and this was the greatest single battle of the Second World War. There were 4 million combatants in this war, and there were something over 1.8 million casualties in this war, in this battle. Went on for 6 months. The Russians lost in that battle more people that were killed who were Russian in the battle than the United States lost in the entire Second World War, in the Japanese theater and the European theater, Pacific theater, I should say. Notably, about 7 million Ukrainians served in the Red Army. So when you talk about these divisions between Ukraine and Russia, these things are apocryphal. And on a day like this, that entire country bows its knee and bends its knee and thinks about what it owes to what was done at that time. And therefore, the image of German tanks in Ukraine, no matter what anybody decides to qualify or to amend or try to spin, the image of that in Russia invokes something which is not even within the comprehension of most Americans or most people who are not from that part of the world. So the war being fought by Russia is not the war that you have been told about or has been in the papers here or other people here are thinking about in any way, shape, or form. And what Scott Ritter has done recently in the very long interview that was done 2 nights ago with the Duran, it's called. It's something you see on the internet. If you put that in 2 minutes, 2 hours and 42 seconds, I believe. What he did was to outline why the United States does not have the physical capability, nor does Europe, to sustain anything like the kind of military process that would be required to even have Ukraine win an honorable stalemate. You're in a situation already, as the Rand Corporation or others have been indicating, there is now a rethinking of some of the stuff in the United States. That the situation is that you've got to pull out of that area in terms of being committed to some sort of victory. That's over. But that doesn't mean, and this is the most important thing I'd like to leave everybody with, that that withdrawal will happen in history. Most of the time, political forces in charge of societies that are dying, political forces in charge of dying civilizations, accelerate the death of those societies. So most of the time, you do not, in fact, correct precisely what you are now living in. You're living in something in which the axioms of the society, which had been challenged by Lyndon LaRouche and refuted by Lyndon LaRouche's physical economy in particular, and it's specific with respect to the United States, where LaRouche pointed out and made it clear that the machine tool sector of the United States and the heavy industrial sector of the United States needed to have an employment involving approximately 35 to 45% of the total workforce. We're leaving out agriculture here in particular, but between 35 and 45% of workforce in that form of advanced machine tool dominated enterprises, and we didn't do that. We disinvested in that, and as a result, you do not have, including in the military sector, the means to fight a war in depth. You can fight a nuclear war, you can fight blitzkrieg actions, you can do special forces kidnapping sort of actions, but the kind of thing that we required in this case, the United States cannot do it, and certainly Europe can't do it. So we're in a circumstance in which the possibility for a mad action is greater than at any time in human history involving these weapons of mass destruction, and therefore, let's say, since 45. Obviously, at other times in human history, there have been crazy people. But this is the first time that a crazy person, even literally one or two, could literally destroy the entire human species. And so it's urgent that every citizen, every one of us, in one sense, mentally anyway, drop everything else to address this issue. What does it mean to be a world citizen? What does it mean to support good people around the world and governments that are actually moving ahead by means of progress all over the world, regardless of what you think about their ideology? And it requires a Damascus Road kind of change of American participation in politics, where it has to be neither simply knee-jerk voting for some party, nor anarchists running out in the street and burning police cars. You have another way, and we are not aligned with either one of those. We have our own independent, clear approach, and to discuss how that approach has become an important weapon in the toolbox of international forces that are trying to, in fact, eradicate poverty and do many of the things that Lyndon LaRouche dedicated his life to. We have Richard Black who will speak to us. Let me also say we're going to be curtailing things tonight, probably just around after 10 o'clock because of the amount of work that has to be done. So, Richard, if you're there, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's very clear.
Okay, good. What I want to talk a bit tonight about is the fact that dozens of nations across the globe are now in very intense meetings and discussion forming a new international monetary and trade system. And as Dennis mentioned, this is a non-predatory trade system based on the development of peoples, the elimination of poverty, and giving to the children of each nation, small and large, the gift of knowledge and creativity and the ability to make a contribution to civilization as a whole. This will be the topic of our conference, as Dennis mentioned, on Saturday morning at 10 a.m. The title, as you may know, is called The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. It will have an extraordinary panel of leaders from every corner of the globe. The morning session is entitled How Nuclear World War III Can Be Avoided. And then there'll be a question and answer period. People will be able to send in their questions, and there'll be a debate. The afternoon panel is entitled The Name of Peace, a New Security and Economic Development Architecture. So that's at 10 a.m. on Saturday. You can access that at the SchillerInstitute.com website or the LaRouche Organization website. So definitely work hard to get the word out to friends and family over the next day to build up the audience. I want to take us back to about 20 years to the year 2000, at the end of 2000. Lyndon LaRouche wrote a pivotal paper which received wide circulation called On a Basket of Hard Commodities, Trade Without Currency. And what he outlined there is the method and the shape of a new international monetary system involving all nations, which is non-predatory and based upon equity. If people are at home, and as I speak, you can, if you have a globe of the world in the house, grab it. If you can access an atlas or a map of the world, open that up. I think it will make a bit more dramatic the report that I'm going to try to give you. If you just look at the last 2 weeks of developments, which come out of this ongoing, intensive series of conferences, meetings, negotiations, some public, some non-public, among nations across the globe, what do we have? Djibouti and China have signed agreements to build in Djibouti a spaceport, the first launch center for rockets for the placement of satellites of all kinds around the globe in Africa. Take a look at where Djibouti is, in the northeast of Africa. It's the tiniest nation in Africa. I believe it has under 1 million people. Well, they just signed an agreement with China, 1.4 billion people. And that discussion, that agreement, that common vision is going to help catapult Africa into the space age. On the same week that this was widely announced, the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, was in South Africa. He met with the very powerfully minded foreign minister of South Africa, Dr. Pandor. His theme in his discussions with Dr. Pandor was collaboration, Russia and South Africa, on space research, on infrastructure, and on high technology development. Dr. Pandor, from her side, said, we need a new international system which is not rigged for the benefit of the rich nations. After Foreign Minister LaRouche left South Africa, he proceeded to further negotiations in Angola around similar topics. At the same time, the Russian President Putin was addressing the nations in Central Europe of what's called the Eurasian Economic Union, Russia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Belarus, small group of nations located there. And what was Putin's theme? Again, this was just a week and a half ago. He said, we're going to collaborate, the nations here, on cutting-edge science and technology, and we're going to lay out and implement plans from now through the year 2045, a plan to create a future, a sustained plan. Glaziev, some of you may have followed, Sergei Glaziev, probably the most brilliant economist, scientist in Russia from the standpoint of monetary systems and science-driven economy. He flew to Indonesia, meeting with the leadership there, and talked about the collaboration between the nations of Central Europe and Asia, the Eurasian Economic Union, and the nations of Southeast Asia, called the ASEAN Group. And all kinds of agreements and plans were made out of that discussion. And as Dennis mentioned, the president of Brazil, Lula, who was one of the ardent founders years ago of the very important grouping, the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Yes, he announced we need a peace club, as Dennis described. Now, where did he get this idea? Look at your map. Look at the size of Brazil. Think of how Dennis described Brazil. Well, he reports that he got this idea from the president of East Timor, a nation of about 1 million people. Look at Indonesia, a big country. Find East Timor. It's a tiny section of a tiny island. Well, the president of East Timor is a man by the name of Jose Ramos Horta, a significant intellect. I think it was in 1996 he received the Nobel Prize for Peace in settling the sovereignty question between East Timor and Indonesia. And it was Jose Ramos Horta who suggested to Brazil, you must organize a club for peace. And Lula said, yes, we will do it. I want to sort of emphasize that LaRouche, in his forecast, in his prophecy of the year 2000, in this paper that I mentioned, Trade Without Currency, here's how LaRouche described what needed to be done. He said, again, this is, I believe, August of 2000. He said, we are thus in a condition in which even many among the world's leading currencies will have to be simply wiped from the accounts or put through bankruptcy reorganization under the authority of a new world system. In this transition, many presently leading currencies ought to be either systematically reorganized or replaced by newly defined currencies and related credit mechanisms. These currencies can be reorganized or created. created so only by reversing recent trends of globalization. Now, follow this, by invoking the credit-creating authority of the perfectly sovereign nation-state. That's a concept. That's the concept idea of what LaRouche said must be done. This is in the year 2000. And in fact, that exact notion is what is being implemented by people such as Sergei Glasiev today. I mean, it really does strike me that what we see in this dialogue process internationally, you have the role of giant nations, but you have the equally important role of nations which are tiny. East Timor, Djibouti. It's a dialogue process which is really unprecedented in the recent period. And the unifying idea is this idea of the sovereignty of each nation. Helga refers to it as a partnership of perfectly sovereign nation states. Many of you who are familiar with our websites know that Helga LaRouche, the founder and the director of the Schiller Institute, recently put forward a proposal for international discussion, 10 principles for the formation of a new world economic order. And the first principle, she says, is that what is required is a partnership of perfectly sovereign nation states. That's principle number one. So what we see, what strikes me is that this question of sovereignty and economic development are inextricably bound. And the dialogue that's going on today involves the poorest countries and the richest, involves the biggest countries and the smallest, because it's based upon this idea that LaRouche has talked about historically, and Helga revives again today, the perfect equality among perfectly sovereign nation states. Now, after her first principle of this partnership of such states, she says, well, what is the content of this sovereignty? Well, in principle number 4, she outlines the necessity of universal education of the citizens within each nation. Number 5, she outlines, as we're discussing, a new international economic system, replacing the currently dying and, as Dennis said, predatory one. Number 6, advanced infrastructure. Absolutely complete necessity. Hard infrastructure, rail, energy, etc. Soft infrastructure, such as education and culture. In number 7, she says, what's required among nations is what would be seen now as a new method of thinking. And she goes back to the European Renaissance and the giants of that age, such as Nicholas of Cusa, whose philosophical mind really changed the course of history then. Those ideas have to be put into practice today. And her last, the last principle, the 10th principle, is, I found, in talking to various people from around the world, is the most controversial. She says that I'm looking at the printout now. She says the man is fundamentally good and capable to infinitely perfect the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul. She says that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and in cohesion. Therefore, she says, that the generation of truthful conception of powerful ideas are the most powerful force in the universe. And that is the capability of each sovereign nation and each person within that sovereign nation. Now, I can give you a bit of a report in my talking to representatives of various governments about this. I find there are different areas of emphasis. In talking to Russian leaders, they very much emphasize sovereignty. We have to defend the sovereignty of each nation. One Russian said to me, Richard, there are very few sovereign nations today. Fortunately, Russia is sovereign. But what they mean by sovereign is the power for self-determination, the power for freedom to act outside of Anglo-American dictates, outside of sanctions. In talking to the Chinese, what is this question of sovereignty? Well, it's freedom from poverty. It's the pursuit of basic fundamental science research, propagating that through the economy. And perhaps most strangely, the aesthetic education of the population. And I think probably the listenership of this program know that by October of 2020, China, a nation of 1.4 billion people, had eliminated 100% of extreme poverty. This is astounding. Never been done before in history. The shockwaves of that as a proof of what can be done, the shockwaves hitting Africa, Central America, Southeast Asia, South America, and those who know about it in the cities of the United States has been tremendous. And I, without going into details now, we don't have time, this was a methodical scientific effort by the Chinese over the course of a couple of decades. There were 240,000 farm experts, social workers, architects, engineers, builders, educators, teachers of all sorts. 240,000 people employed by the federal government in China who went out into every tiny village, every city, every secondary, tertiary city, and mapped out who's poor and figured out, village by village, house by house, how to get people out of poverty. Job creation, moving from the countries into the city, the development of the crafts and the artistic capability of each of the ethnic groups in China. There are 52 of them. It was an amazing effort. This is the Chinese notion of sovereignty. Their current 5-year plan has as its center a different metric than we use in the West about economic success. Their view is, if you want a successful economy, you have to track the rate of increase of scientific and technological advances. And if you can accelerate continually the rate of scientific and technological discovery, you propagate that through the economy, lift up the education of the population, and lift up the productive output. Lastly, in China, over the last, I would say, maybe 7 years, there's been a concerted campaign around the aesthetical education of young people in China, with a revival of the great man of ideas, Confucius, as a standard. You can think of him as the Socrates of China. They lived within 100 years of each other. And if you go to China, as I have, what you see is dozens and dozens of new concert halls, packed to the gills with people listening to classical music, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, classical Chinese music in revival. You see dozens and dozens of new gigantic museums documenting the 5,000-year-old history of China. So this idea of the development of the citizenry, the focus on science, the eradication of poverty, this comes forth as you talk to the Chinese, what their notion of sovereignty is. In India, it's somewhat different. They're still very connected to having broken the back of British colonialism. So the right to economic development, the ability to transcend those shackles, this is right in the front of the mind of Indian leaders. And this is why they played such a dynamic and muscular role in breaking the back of this Green Raw Deal fraud of telling the impoverished nations of the world, you can't use fossil fuels, you can't use this, you can't use that, you have to live on less and less and less. The whole CO2 fraud. India has been at the forefront to break the back of this, and the back has been broken. If you look at us here in the United States, and you look at the political class today, it's hard to find, except for the Schiller Institute and our collaborators, those who think about sovereignty from the standpoint of the human mind. But if you go back to FDR, 1941, people have studied his 4 freedoms. Again, about mind, freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of speech, freedom to conceptualize the whole universe, or freedom of religion as a guaranteed fundamental right. So this question of sovereignty. I want to give you an idea, this question of national sovereignty that Helga brings up in the 10 principles is being debated, discussed widely across the globe as it's been circulating in many, many languages. There's been a very intensive dialogue with several leading figures. Sergei Glaziev, as I mentioned earlier, from Russia. He's part of the executive board of this Eurasian Economic Union, former advisor to Putin, in an intense dialogue with economists in Russia, from Dr. Wang Wen from Renmin University. And in their discussion, they're outlining a new international monetary system which has several features. It would include a gold reserve-backed currency, a focus on investment in the real economy, trade using not the dollar, but the ruble or the Chinese yuan or the Indian rupee or regional currencies to be invented. The Chinese have this wonderful idea of patient capital, which means you make an investment in infrastructure, in science, and you don't expect a return for 10 or 20 years. They call it patient capital. It's like when a young couple buys a home and takes out a 20 or 30-year mortgage. You pay it back in 20 or 30 years. This is a long production cycle. In that case, the production of a family. In the case of patient capital, the development of nations. Credit has to be controlled by the government. You have to have a national bank to do that. LaRouche's concept of a science driver for the economy as a whole is being widely discussed. And currency values ought to be tied to valuable commodities, including gold. Here's what, in an article a few days ago, here's how Glaziev put it. This is Glaziev writing with one of his colleagues. In the face of unprecedented sanctions pressure, Russia's task is not to learn to play by the crooked rules of the West, but to build transparent and mutually beneficial rules of the game with friendly countries, to create their own pricing systems, exchange trading, and investment. And gold can be a unique tool in the fight against Western sanctions if you count in it the prices of all major international commodities. oil and gas, food, fertilizer, metals, solid minerals. Fixing the price of oil in gold at the level of 2 barrels of oil for 1 gram of gold will increase the price of gold in dollars 2 times. This is the calculation of the Credit Suisse economist Zoltan Pozsar. This would be an adequate response to the so-called price ceiling introduced by the West. It would be a kind of floor, a solid foundation. And then India and China could take the place of global commodity traders such as Glencore and Trafigura. So this is what is being actively discussed. You won't read about it in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, CNBC, or anywhere else. This is the main discussion among nations across the globe, large and small. So, as I reviewed this afternoon, thinking about how I could best give a short report, this really did give me a sort of renewed insight, I would say, to something which has been a concept of the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement before the Institute was formed in 1984, going back to the late 60s, in which we often quoted another great intellectual, Pope Paul VI, who in one of his encyclicals, Populum Progressio, writes that the name of peace is economic development. The new name of peace, he said, is economic development. So, in a sense, this for me puts into relief both the power of LaRouche's proposals and the reason for their extreme popularity today. And if you think back, how did this occur? Look at an earlier period, before the year 2000. Go back to 1975. Some of you know the history. In 75, LaRouche, after returning from a trip to Iraq, he writes a proposal then in 75 for a new international system called the IDB, the International Development Bank. We publish it in many, many languages. It's discussed and debated. And within a year, in 76, 2 very small nations take the lead in putting it center stage. In Sri Lanka, the island nation off of India, the very courageous and brilliant president there, Mrs. Bandaranaike, takes this up. In Colombo, Sri Lanka, this was a meeting of a group of the non-aligned. And at that meeting in Sri Lanka in 76, the ideas of LaRouche are put forward and adopted. A new world economic order is required, debt moratoria for the poorest nations, a new system based upon the rights of man. And in the same year, a very good friend who Dennis knew personally very well, Dr. Fred Wills, the brilliant foreign minister of Guyana, speaking at the United Nations, calls for the formation of international development banks in order to launch such a new international monetary system. That's 1976. LaRouche puts flesh on the bone, so to speak, in a series of articles such as the one I cited in the year 2000. And now today, in 2023, nations very large and very small are in dialogue around the connection between sovereignty, human rights, and economic development. You add the work of these small voices, Djibouti, East Timor, Guyana, Sri Lanka, add that to the giants who formed themselves relatively recently into the BRICS, a group of nations. Brazil, think of the size, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And now you have a capability where all of this can be moved forward. So LaRouche always used to talk about the power of an idea and the power of one man and one woman taking an idea, creating an idea, and moving all of civilization in that direction. So, what's the moral of the story? Next time you're attempting to recruit someone in your family, a friend, somebody at work, to join our movement, and they say, well, I'm just one person. Begin to tell them the story about what just one person and just one nation as an organizing force with the appropriate scientific ideas can accomplish.